Self-study. Imagination is one of the principal sources of the wrong work of centers. Each center has its own form of imagination and daydreaming. However, as a rule, both the moving and the emotional centers make use of the thinking center, which readily places itself at their disposal for this purpose, because daydreaming corresponds to its own inclinations. Daydreaming is the opposite of useful mental activity. Useful in this case meaning, activity directed towards a definite aim, and undertaken for the sake of obtaining a definite result. Daydreaming does not pursue any aim, nor does it strive after any result. The motive for daydreaming lies always in the emotional, or in the moving center. The actual process, however, is carried out by the thinking center. The inclination to daydream is due partly to the laziness of the thinking center, that is, its attempts to avoid the effort connected with work, directed towards a definite aim and going in a definite direction. Then to the tendency of the emotional and moving centers to repeat to themselves and keep alive, or to recreate experiences both pleasant and unpleasant, that have been previously lived through or imagined. Daydreaming of disagreeable, morbid things is characteristic of the unbalanced state of the human machine. One can understand daydreaming of a pleasant nature, and find logical justification for it. Daydreaming of an unpleasant character, however, is an absurdity, yet many people spend 9/10 of their lives in just such painful daydreams about misfortunes that may overtake them or their family, about illness they may contract, or sufferings they will have to endure. Imagination and daydreaming are examples of the wrong work of the thinking center. Observation of the activity of imagination and daydreaming forms a very important part of self-study. The next object of self-observation must be habits in general. Every adult consists almost entirely of habit, although they are often unaware of it, and may even deny having any habits at all. This can never be the case, as all three centers are filled with habits, and an individual cannot know themselves until they have studied their habits. The observation and the study of habits is particularly difficult, because in order to see and to record them, one must escape from them, and free oneself from them, even if it is only for a moment. As long as we are governed by a particular habit, we do not observe it. Nevertheless, at the very first attempt, however feeble this might be to struggle against, we feel and notice it. In order therefore to study habits, one must try to struggle against them. This opens up a practical method of self-observation. It has been noted that we cannot change anything in ourselves, that we can only observe and record. This is of course true, however it is also true to say that one cannot observe and record anything if we do not try to struggle with ourselves, that is to say, with our habits. This struggle cannot yield direct results, namely it cannot lead to any change, particularly to any permanent or lasting change. However, it does show exactly what is there. Without struggle, a person cannot see what they consist of. The struggle with small habits is very difficult and boring, but without it self-observation is impossible. Even at the first attempt to study elementary activity in the moving center, a person comes up against habits. For example, one might want to study their movements, may want to observe how they walk. They will not succeed in doing so for more than a moment if they continue to walk in the usual way. If they understand, though, that their usual way of walking consists of a number of habits, for example of taking steps of a certain length, walking at a certain speed, a certain rhythm and so on, then they begin to try to alter that, to walk faster or slower, to take bigger or smaller steps. They will then be able to observe themselves and study their movements as they walk. If a person wants to observe themselves when they are writing, they must take note of how they hold the pen, then try to hold it in a different way from the usual, after which observation will become possible. In order to observe themselves, a person must not walk in their habitual way, they must sit in unaccustomed positions, they must stand when they are used to sitting, and sit when they expect to stand. They must make with their left hand the movements they are accustomed to making with their right and vice versa. All of this will help them to observe themselves, and study the associations of the moving center. In the sphere of emotions, it is useful to try to struggle with the habit of giving immediate expression to one's unpleasant emotions. Many people, for instance, find it difficult to refrain from expressing their feelings about bad weather. It is even more difficult for people not to express unpleasant emotions when they feel that something or someone is violating what they may conceive to be order or justice. Aside from being a good method of self-observation, this struggle against expressing unpleasant emotions has at the same time another significance. It is one of the few directions in which a person can change themselves or their habits without creating other undesirable habits. Self-study and self-observation must therefore be accompanied by a struggle against the expression of unpleasant emotions. If an individual follows all of these rules whilst observing themselves, they will then record a whole series of very important aspects of their being. To begin with, they will record with clarity the fact that their actions, thoughts, feelings and words are the result of external influences, and that nothing comes from themselves. They will understand and see that they are in fact on autopilot, and acting under the influence of external stimuli, becoming aware of their complete mechanicalness. Everything seems to just happen, they cannot actually do a thing, and are simply a mechanism controlled by accidental shocks from the outside, as each shock calls to the surface one of their eyes. A new shock and that eye disappears, a different one takes its place. Another small change in the environment and yet another new eye is called to the fore. A person will begin to understand that they have no control over themselves whatsoever, and that they do not really know what they may say or do in the next moment. They will begin to understand that they cannot answer for themselves even for the shortest length of time. Understand that if they remain the same, and do nothing unexpected, it is simply because no unexpected outside changes are taking place around them. Understand that their actions are entirely controlled by external conditions, become convinced that there is nothing permanent in them from which control could possibly come, not one single permanent function, and not one single permanent state. In beginning to observe oneself in the right way, a person can begin to change themselves and should never find themselves to be right. The requirement not to express negative emotions then becomes the basis of their subsequent development through this system of work. The relationship between the moving and instinctive functions can now be examined, and the question asked, is it possible to divide our actions in the traditional way, into conscious actions, automatic actions, which must at first be conscious, instinctive actions, expedient, but with consciousness of purpose, and reflexes, both simple and complex that are never conscious, and which can in certain cases be expedient. In addition to this there are also actions performed under the influence of hidden emotional dispositions, or unknown inner impulses. Conscious actions are not possible because at this stage, there is nothing conscious in us that is capable of acting or of doing anything. The term subconscious that plays such a large part in the place of modern psychology, has become misleading, because phenomena of quite different nature are classified under this category of subconscious. The division of actions according to the centers controlling them, on the other hand, does away with uncertainty as to the correctness of these divisions. What is important to note is that the same action can originate in different centers. An example of this is the recruit and the old soldier at rifle drill. One has to perform the drill with their thinking center, and the other does it with the moving center, which accomplishes it much better. Actions governed by the moving center cannot be called automatic though. We can use the term automatic only for the actions that a person performs imperceptibly for themselves. If the same actions are observed by a person, then they cannot be called automatic. The moving functions are distinct from automatic functions, and what is most important is that automatic functions are to be found in all centers. Automatic thoughts and automatic feelings must be differentiated from reflexes that are instinctive actions, and among external movements only reflexes can be regarded as instinctive actions. The words instinct and instinctive are often misused, and should instead be applied only to the inner functions of an organism. The beating of the heart, regular breathing, circulation of blood or lymph, digestion of food, these are all instinctive functions. The only external functions that belong to this category are reflexes. The difference between instinctive and moving functions can hence be explained as follows. The moving functions of both man and animals, of a bird or a dog, must be learned. Instinctive functions only are inborn. A man has very few inborn external movements, an animal has more, however they vary, and some species have more than others. What is usually explained as instinct is quite often a series of complex moving functions that young animals learn from older ones. One of the chief properties of the moving center is its ability to imitate. The moving center imitates what it sees without reasoning. This is the origin of the misconception that exists about the wonderful intelligence of animals, or the instinct that takes the place of intelligence and makes them perform a series of complex and expedient actions. The idea of an independent moving center that on the one hand does not depend upon the mind, does not require the mind at all, and is a mind in and of itself, but on the other hand does not depend upon instinct and has first to learn or mimic, becomes an absurdity. The existence of a moving center working by means of imitation explains the preservation of the existing order in beehives, termites and anthills. Directed by imitation, one generation has had to shape itself absolutely upon the model of another. There could be no changes, no departure whatever from the model. But imitation does not explain how such an order was arrived at in the first place. To answer this, one needs to understand that each center is not only a motive force but also a receiving apparatus, working as a receiver for different and sometimes very distant influences. If you consider what has been previously noted about wars, revolutions, migration of peoples and so on. When we picture how masses of humanity can move under the control of planetary influences, then one can begin to understand the fundamental mistake made when determining the actions of an individual. Our mistake lies in regarding the actions of an individual as originating in themselves. We find it difficult to grasp that the masses may consist of automatons, obeying external stimuli and move, not under the influence of their will, consciousness, or the inclination of individuals, but under the influence of external stimuli, coming possibly from very far away. Can the instinctive and moving functions thus be controlled by two distinct centers? They can, and to them must be added a third, the sex center. These are the three centers of the lower level. The sex center is the neutralizing center at this point, with relation to the instinctive and the moving centers. The lower level can therefore exist by itself, because the three centers in it are the conductors of three forces. The thinking and the emotional centers, on the other hand, are not indispensable for life. The question of which of these centers is active and which is passive in the lower level changes. One moment the moving center is active, and the instinctive passive. Another moment the instinctive is active, and the moving is passive. Examples of this can be found if you reason it out. However, aside from different states, there are also different types. In some people the moving center is more active, in others the instinctive center. For the sake of convenience in reasoning, and particularly in the beginning, when it is important to explain principles, we take them however as one center, with different functions that are on the same level. If we take the thinking, the emotional and the moving centers, then they work on different levels. The moving and the instinctive are on one level. Later, we will examine what these levels mean, and upon what they depend.